President of Grin2B Foundation. Thank you for joining our Grin2B Hive webinar week. This webinar is called Intro to AAC. AAC stands for Alternative Augmentative Communication. Our presenter, Heidi Rabe, is a speech-language pathologist with over 20 years of experience working with children and adults with a variety of complex communication challenges, and she specializes in AAC. In this presentation, Heidi will define AAC, review common terms, explain best practices in supporting communication development for our children, and bust some myths. She covers a lot of amazing information. If you want to skip ahead to a specific section, please check out our webinar description right under this video, as we have listed the starting time code for each of the 4 topics. Impairments in communication are one of the most common symptoms among our loved ones with Grin2B. Whether their speech is limited or they are non-speaking, what you will learn from this presentation is that any of our Bs can benefit from AAC. Thanks again for watching this webinar, and let us know if you have any feedback.
So today I will be talking about Intro to AAC. My name is Heidi Rabe. I am a speech-language pathologist and owner of Authentic Expression, LLC, and I'm extremely excited to be talking to you about one of my favorite topics of augmentative alternative communication. If you want to see a copy of the handout, so on Google Slides, there's a QR code in the corner that you can scan, and it will get you a copy of that should allow you to view the handout separately. So that QR code is right there. Again, the handouts can also be found at bit.ly/introAAC. And then you can follow along if you want to, or want to reference them outside of this presentation. So I want to give you a little bit of information about me before we get started. So I am a speech-language pathologist. A speech-language therapist is the title in the UK, speechy in Australia. Some people call it speech therapist. We have lots of names, similar title, or similar job. Like I said, I've been a speech therapist for a little over 20 years, and I have always specialized in working with children and adults with complex disabilities and developmental disabilities and complex communication needs. So I've worked in a variety of settings throughout my career, and including 2 different countries. I worked in Ireland for 3 years. And I started Authentic Expression, LLC in 2016. So when I'm not working, I love to create. So I knit, I sew, I weave. We also love to travel, and I spoil my many cats. If anyone is watching this to report for professional development hours, these are my disclosures. That's just a technicality for people who are watching this for professional reasons. Or not just technicality, it's also important to know. But enough about me. Let's dive into AAC. So today we are going to define AAC and some of the common terms, and we're going to talk a little bit about supporting communication development and bust some myths. So let's go. Let's dive into this. So what is AAC? To start with, I want to think globally, and then we're going to go a little bit into deep dives into a little of the nuances. So we all communicate in a variety of ways and for a variety of purposes. So when thinking about communication, on a lark one day, I asked all of my Facebook friends, how do you communicate and why do you communicate? And this word art represents their answers. So it's a very non-scientific sampling, but a random sampling of about 300 people. And it represents the why of communication and the how. So when we're thinking about AAC, we should be thinking about these. And I want you to take a moment to think about why you communicate every day. Now think about the list that you either created in your head or that you actually wrote down. I know I didn't give you much time, but it's YouTube, so you can pause if you need to. Were there any themes in it? If you're like most people, most of us communicate for social closeness. We don't communicate only just to meet our wants and needs, unless you consider one of those needs social communication. And that is oftentimes a huge need for people. So we communicate to strengthen our relationships with other people and to have connections. Communication is about forming relationships and connections. And the same is true for people who cannot use their natural speech as their primary means of communication. So it's our job as therapists, parents, caregivers, teachers, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, whoever we are, an important person in the life of someone with complex communication needs, to support those relationships and to understand the way they want to communicate and to respect that and to support that development and that growth. So continuing to think about the why of communication leads us to solving to the what of communication challenges and what communication challenges do we face on a daily basis. So, because we all have them. So connecting with others, making decisions about what to have for dinner, finding out what a family member's schedule is, when they're going to be home or when they're going to stop working. All of these are communication challenges that we have throughout our day. What to do when someone doesn't understand us, how to repair that communication. So we naturally read the situation, assess it, problem solve, and use language to express ourselves. But people with communication disorders may not do this as efficiently. So are we teaching them how to solve their communication challenges that they have throughout the day? Are we supporting the development in all areas of communication, not just request, to solve those communication challenges that we all have every day? So are we teaching this how to communicate in social closeness and express social closeness, to express frustration symbolically? Those are the communication challenges we all have. And that's really what this quote is getting at. And if you notice, it's from 2003. So this information, this thinking has been around for a while, even back before that. So we've talked a little bit about the greater umbrella of communication and narrowing it down to what is AAC. AAC stands for Augmentative Alternative Communication, and the American Speech Language Hearing Association, known as ASHA, defines it as any way of communicating that is other than talking. So sending a text message, writing an email, smiling, waving to somebody you know. These are all forms of AAC that we all use almost every day. Oftentimes when we think of AAC, we think of the complex systems on a computer or an iPad, but there are many forms of AAC that we use every day, that all of us use every day. So it's all of the ways of communicating and sharing our ideas and feelings without talking, so without natural speech. And sometimes we may forget the power of being understood. And that goes back to the earlier quote about communication challenges, and that the purpose of communication is to solve communication challenges. And one challenge that we face every day is being understood by others. So I want you to take a moment to read this quote from Heidi on what AAC means to him. So he thinks that his brain is the best part of his body, and I have to agree with him. He's a pretty smart and pretty intuitive kid. And this is from when he was 8, and just learning to use his complex AAC system. And this quote explains how he feels about the system and that it enables him to express himself. He can do his homework more efficiently on it. So it can take him less than half the time to do his homework than it would without it. And he can show other people what he knows. He can be understood and have that basic human need of connection and being understood met by using AAC, even though he does have intelligible speech as well and uses his natural speech to communicate to. He uses both, just like we all use both AAC and natural speech. So what are we thinking about with so when I'm saying natural speech, I'm also, and I will define this a little bit more when we get to common terms, that is what I'm using right now, my natural voice. But there are other forms of AAC, and natural speech isn't a form of AAC. That is the natural way of communicating. But what are some forms of AAC? So there's sign language. So American Sign Language, British Sign Language, any actual sign language is just that, a language. It has its own method, its own grammar, it has its own syntax, it has its own rules of the language. It is a language in and of itself, but some people use it as another way to communicate when verbal speech is difficult for them. Also, gestures. We all use gestures pretty often in our daily lives, and we use facial expressions. That's how we read to know oftentimes how people are feeling or make guesses about how people are feeling. There's picture exchanges, picture systems. So we also see pictures and we have graphics. So we have logos. So we know the McDonald's arch, that M means McDonald's arch, even without seeing the word McDonald's underneath it. We know the Target logo in the US. We know all of the logos generally because they are symbols. And then there's also voice output devices. So devices that produce speech after a certain sequence of button presses. But I want you to take a moment to think about, so those are the common forms that people who can't use natural speech use, but I want you to think about how many different forms of AAC you use in your life. So when I thought about this as part of this presentation, outside of work, because within work I use a lot more, but outside of work, I use about 7 forms of AAC in my daily life. So I type on a keyboard, I use emojis when I'm texting and sending emails. I use Bitmojis, which are kind of like emojis, but they're still different. Photos, gestures, facial expressions, and I use affections such as hugs and kisses. So we're using AAC all the time in our lives. We're not necessarily thinking of it as AAC because we're all multimodal communicators. So what are some of the common terms in AAC? So you've already heard me say natural speech. Another term to go with natural speech is mouth words. Within the disability community and the community of people who use AAC and somewhat the autistic community, there is a movement to get away from using nonverbal or limited verbal or minimally verbal because there are a lot of connotations with that, and people assume language levels, which is different than speech levels. So language is our understanding, and speech is the means that we use to show that understanding. So if our speech, our natural speech, our voice is not, or mouth words are not able to express what we're thinking, the difficulty is in the expression, not necessarily the understanding. So I have shifted to natural speech or mouth words. I usually use natural speech as my terminology. Some people who use AAC prefer the term mouth words because that's literally where the words are coming from, as opposed to AAC words or device words. So those are all terms that you may hear to describe how much vocal, they'll also refer to vocal, vocalizations, how much sound is coming out of someone's mouth. So modeling. Modeling is a term that gets a lot of attention in the AAC world and can be very confusing. So modeling within the context of AAC oftentimes means using the device without expectation of the other person to use it. So us using the device ourselves for our own communication. So we are modeling. It is often used as a synonym for demonstration and aided language input. So all three of those terms are used synonymously in the AAC world. So modeling is often the adult or caregiver, someone other than the person who needs to use AAC, using the system for their own messages to show and demonstrate what can be done with the system. Modeling can also have an expectation where you are showing them what you think they want to say on their system. So if someone is crying and you label, you looks like you feel sad or you feel mad, that you're labeling and mapping the symbolic onto from the non-symbolic. So modeling can have those two definitions. And in the ABA world and teaching world, modeling is showing someone and then expecting them to imitate. Within AAC, there's often modeling without expectation of imitation. So aided language input, fancy term for you, the caregiver, teacher, therapist, important person in this person's life, using the system that they are using for your own communication, not what you want them to express, what you yourself want to express. Same thing as demonstration, using it for what you yourself want to express, not what you think they want to express, or what you think they should be expressing. Demonstration can also showing them how to navigate and how to use the system. So multimodal communication. We are all multimodal communicators. Very fancy term, very big words to mean we all communicate in a lot of different ways. We use gestures, we use sign language, we use facial expressions. Those are all different modes of communication. So we are all multimodal communicators, and people who use AAC also should be encouraged to be multimodal communicators, because there is no one system fits all. Core and fringe. So cores are the little words that make up language. There are between 300 and 500 words that make up 80 to 90% of everyone's speech. So researchers have analyzed speech samples from kids as young as 18 months all the way up to 100 or into the elderly. So, and across that whole age spectrum. And we all use the same small subset of words to communicate most of our messages. And it makes about 80% of our messages. Fringe makes the other 20. So core words are often those little words, those grammar words, such as the, is, in, at. So I like to go to the store. So I like to go to the. All of those are core words. Store would be generally considered a fringe word. Your fringe words are more of your nouns. But you also have something called personal core. And your personal core are the words that you personally use often, but other people don't. So as a knitter, I have this whole extra set of words that I use pretty regularly with my knitting friends or my poor husband or anyone else who will listen to me talk about knitting, that those are very common words for me. And if I were to need a formal AAC system, a high-tech, robust AAC system, I would want those words in my system as my personal core because I use them often. They're important to me. So those are the words, those are high-interest words, like siblings' names would normally be considered that name. If so, I have a brother named James. James would be considered a fringe word normally, but if I talk about my brother a lot, he would become a core word. So the core words are what makes up about 80% of our vocabulary. The fringe are usually nouns and make up about 20%. We need both to have complete grammatical sentences and to express our needs. It is very difficult to express our needs and wants and thoughts with only one or the other. So there's a lot of debate within the AAC world on which one you start with. My answer is both, and let the person pick which ones they want to use, because we need both. So access and alternative access. Access just means how they're physically interacting or using the device. Alternate access means you're using something other than your finger, or not direct, or a stylus, that you're not directly, well, the stylus is often considered an indirect access. So you're using something other than direct contact with a part of your body to access, to touch and interact with the system. The symbol set is the types of symbols that are on that formal system. Array size is a fancy term for how many symbols or buttons or pictures or words you see at a time. And then a switch is a term that is often, I think, misdefined. Some people will use the term switch to mean a single message device. For people who use alternate access, they may physically be touching a switch, so touching something that then controls the device. So think of it as a light switch. Technically, a switch is something that turns on and off and sends an on-off message, or sends an advance choose message. I think switch should not be used for single message devices, because they should be called single message devices. So what are some common systems? Now that we've gotten a whole bunch of terminology down, some common systems are aided and unaided, is kind of the general umbrella term. So aided systems are things you have to take with you. So picture cards, an iPad, a computer, some other form of device that talks for you, or anything that you physically have to carry and is not on your body. So an unaided system are those that are fit, that you don't have to carry with you and that are on your body. So sign language is unaided. Gestures are unaided. Vocalizations are unaided. Speech is unaided. So obviously speech is not AAC, but those are unaided communication systems. Aided systems, you take with you, you have to carry, you may forget it. So low, mid, high tech goes with paper, static, dynamic display. So in the field, people have talked about low, mid, and high tech and defined it many different ways. So you will find many different definitions. Low tech usually refers to paper-based systems. And mid-tech usually refers to single message devices. And back in the day when I was in grad school, I learned if it had a battery, it was mid-tech. If it was high-tech, it had to be plugged in. However, as I said, people do not agree on these definitions. So I personally prefer more specific language of paper-based. So I think that's also more explanatory. So paper-based systems are systems that you print off. So either picture cards that you pull and hand over, or a communication book that has different pictures or words or symbols in it. So basically anything that is based in paper is paper-based. Static display has a display that doesn't move. So when you look at it, it always looks the same. So static display devices may have something called overlay. So pieces of paper that you change and have levels that you physically like turn knobs on to have different amounts of vocabulary programmed into it. But what the person who is using the system sees at any one time is always the same. So some examples of this are the Go Talk, the I Talk to You, the Tech Talk, the Big Mac. All of these are static display devices. They don't change. They themselves do not change based on a press or a selection of the device. Dynamic display devices are what we oftentimes people think of as AAC. So those are systems like iPad or computer-based systems that when you touch one button, another page may come up or something else happens. So if I touch an icon of an apple, an entire page related to food may come up. So food, eat, hungry, different types of food come up. So those are dynamic display. So when you touch one section of it, something else happens on the screen. So the person using it is interacting with the screen in a dynamic way. Oh, and I forgot PECS. So PECS actually stands for Picture Exchange Communication System. It is a formal protocol that has levels to teach someone how to initiate communication and how to request and eventually how to describe. So it is often used synonymously with using pictures to communicate, but it is a formal communication system and protocol. So, types of symbols. There's a lot of terminology in AAC. So there are single meaning symbols. So things like the McDonald's arch always means McDonald's. A picture of my cat Tiffin always means Tiffin. That always means that specific cat. Multiple meaning symbols are things like there's drama masks. So that could mean drama. It could mean represent theater. It could represent feelings. So there are multiple meanings of the symbol or one specific meaning of the symbol. So that's the single versus multiple meaning. Photos are just that, photos. Logos are different type of symbols. So they're highly iconic. So and photos are often highly iconic. So iconicity means how well it represents the thing it's intending to represent. So a photo of my cat Tiffin represents my cat Tiffin very well, but it would have poor iconicity if I'm using a photo of my cat Tiffin to represent all cats in the world. Where a line drawing, which just means that someone has drawn it, is of a cat, is a better representation of all cats of the world rather than just my specific cat. High contrast just means that the background and the images have a high contrast to each other. So oftentimes the background will be either red, black, or yellow. And then the drawing, so depending if the background is black, the drawing will be oftentimes bright colors. So for high contrast, those are often used for people with either visual impairment or cortical vision impairment, so often known as CVI. So for people who have difficulty visually processing information, high contrast symbols can be helpful for them. Letters are a type of symbol. Words. So all of my speech, that's all symbols. So, and sign language are also symbols. So all of these are symbols. Oftentimes we think of drawings as symbols and words, and we forget that words are also symbols. And they're also arbitrary. That the fact that we call this, you can see this a glass or a cup, arbitrary. Why don't we call it a Flangenlangen? Years of language and years of use have caused us to call this a glass, but that's an arbitrary symbol, the same way as line drawings are. And I think that is a very important thing to remember with AAC. We are just teaching them a different symbol set to communicate. So access methods. So we have direct selection. That means that you are directly using a part of your body to interact with the system. So it could be your hand, it could be your foot, it could be your elbow, but you are directly making impact on the system. Scanning is another form of access where you are physically moving choices along, but you're not touching it. So you're hearing or seeing the choices and then doing a different motor movement when you see or hear the one that you want. This is often used for people who have difficulty initiating with motor movements or who have physical disabilities. Eye gaze is you're using your eyes as your access method. So you're looking at the button or the symbol that you want. And then if it's on a system, you're looking at it for a certain amount of time and then it activates. Or if it's on paper-based, you're looking at it and then the person to tell them what you want. Head pointer you either have a dot on your head or literally wear a hat with a pointer, like a stylus on your head, and you're using your head to point and you're using that to point. Mouse control. So also for dynamic displays for robust systems, you can have a dot on your head or some other way of the computer reading, and you're basically controlling the mouse through part of your body. Or a key guard. I think that one's a key guard is generally a piece of plastic that blocks out some of the cells in the buttons and makes it easier to physically access. All right, lots of terms. I think the important thing to know about AAC and accessing different AAC systems, as Lydia says, is to not limit anyone. The different situations require different types of communication access. People who use AAC generally can't take their robust system into the pool or to the beach. They will need a different system there. Or if you're out playing at the park, you may need a different system and different tools. And with different people, you may have different systems and different tools, the same way we communicate differently with different people, depending on our relationship with them. But it's important to not limit people. So, supporting communication development. First thing to remember is that there are no prerequisites for AAC other than being alive. So this does not mean that there are not skills needed to use robust AAC that are different than other forms of AAC. It means that, and it also does not mean that everyone should have the same system and that one type of system is appropriate for everyone. A good communication system facilitates all functions of communication. You do not need to start with requesting, especially if that person is more passive. You can start with protesting. You can start with social interaction, with engagement, with commenting. And there should be there shouldn't be a such thing as beginning AAC, in that a client needs to master one level before going on to the next. Multiple AAC users that I have talked to have said this is annoying and frustrating, that they master one system, they figure out how to use it, and then we graduate them to a more complex system. Where if we started with the more complex system and supported their learning, they would be further along in their communication development. And there are ways to do that. The way that I really learned there's no prerequisites and there's no hierarchy is when I was working in Ireland, that there was a boy who had muscular dystrophy, and we were working on building his communication skills. And I was working on a Big Mac, which is not the thing from McDonald's. It is a single message device that says whenever you press it, it says whatever is programmed into it. And he would take it and just push it, play with it, and just listen to it. He wasn't using it for communication. So I kept trying pictures, kept trying symbols. And one day I got to his school and the staff were like, we've been teaching him sign language and he's learning all of these signs. And I was like, wait, but he's going to lose his ability to use his muscles. But that taught me I was working on the wrong thing. I was stuck in those prereqs and he was learning some sign. So through collaboration with the staff, we got him a more robust system and figured out that he knew what symbols were. He just didn't care about the messages I was pre-programming onto the Big Mac. He wanted more language. So it's not that he didn't understand the cause and effect of the switch of the Big Mac or didn't understand that message. That's just not what he wanted to communicate. So that really taught me there are no prerequisites of moving along. We also want to use AAC whenever speech cannot meet their communication needs. So that is a lot more people than are currently using AAC in more formal ways. And AAC can be short-term or long-term. It doesn't have to be something, and it's not always something that we use throughout our entire lives. And especially when we're thinking of more of like gestures or other systems, we incorporate other systems as we're developing. We don't abandon one simpler form of communication just because we've learned a more complex form. So AAC can also be short-term and a simpler system to help bridge to natural speech, which we will talk about a little bit more later. So as I've said, and kind of harped on, there is no one size fits all. It's really important to do something called feature matching and have an appropriate evaluation to determine the appropriate features of a system. So when people ask on social media, what's your favorite app for this? The answer is the one that meets the client's needs, which is also a frustrating answer because it can be difficult to weed out some of that and to figure it out. But when I am doing an AAC evaluation, I'm looking at, are they visually scanning? So how are they looking at the pictures, the symbols on the array? How many layers deep can they navigate? Whether that's on a paper-based system or a robust dynamic-based system. How many layers can they have? How many symbols can we have at one time? And can this system grow for 3 to 5 years? Because an appropriate system meets the communication needs now and can grow with the person. We really want that growth potential. That's why we don't think of beginning AAC, because it doesn't facilitate their growth. Unless beginning AAC is hiding some of the symbols and having a system that will grow with them. That is appropriate beginning AAC. So also, can it communicate across all environments and functions? So we want to support communicating with grandma. We want to support communicating at the beach with friends. We want to support it in the playground. We want to support it in playtime and reading, at mealtime, all the time. And that does not mean one system. So going back to, we are all multimodal communicators. There's not a one size fits all for people or for situations. The other thing that's very important in AAC is partner or stakeholder buy-in. Because if you're on the professional side of things, we have limited time with the person. And if the stakeholders don't buy into it and don't use it, then it's not a good system and not an appropriate system. And we as professionals need to work with everyone who's important in that person's life. And the people who are important in that person's life need to be comfortable and able to talk about what's important to them for communication and in a communication system and what they can realistically use and do. And these are hard conversations to have. But they're important for supporting communication development, because a typically developing child gets over 1,300 hours of exposure to oral language before we expect them to say their first words. So I did this math. There's a few different statistics that are floating around. One that is actually higher and more input than this. I took a bit more of a conservative view, and I did 5 hours a day for 9 months, because babies sleep a lot. And like I said, it is a low estimate. It's also important to remember that it takes typically developing kids 7 years to achieve linguistic competency. That's over 13,000 hours of exposure to language if they've been exposed 5 hours a day. So it would take 120 years at 2 hours a week, 52 weeks a year to get that same level exposure of an AAC system as we give for oral speech. Which is why stakeholders really need to be involved. As parents, as aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, everybody needs to be using the system and immersing them in the AAC systems. Because it would take 13 years at that 1350, it would take 13 years for them to have the same level of input of 2 hours a week of therapy at 52 weeks a year, which not many people in the US get. So the more realistic, which still is high in some of the systems in the US at least, and I think abroad, is at 90 minutes of therapy per week for 36 weeks a year, which is a typical school year. It would take 25 years for, if the SLP was constantly demonstrating and using the system for their own communication, for that person to get the same level of language input as kids typically get by 9 months. So we are expecting people to use a system that is more complex and difficult in many ways because there's more navigation with less demonstration and teaching. That is why caregivers need to use it as well. So we need to be teaching stakeholders how to operate the device, but we also need to know, knowing how to operate the device does not translate into using the device, which is why me and myself as a professional, I teach programming generally last, because it's really the how to use the device and being comfortable using the device for your own communication. That's the hard part. And that's the part that we need stakeholders in the person's life to do every day. And you guys can look over that, but that kind of talks more about it. So spending a few minutes to dive into some of the myths of AAC. There are a lot of them. These are just the ones that I encounter most in my life. So the first one is that AAC will keep someone from talking. So it doesn't. As I mentioned, a person doesn't abandon simpler strategies in the march towards independence. We still use gestures, even though we're talking and using natural speech to communicate. The same way an AAC person will still use, someone who uses AAC will still use gestures to communicate, may still use signs when they're using a robust system, or they may still use pictures when they have a robust system. We're all multimodal communicators, and speech is the finest motor movement that we need to do, and it's the most refined motor movement, but it's still easier than navigating an AAC system. There are a lot of extra cognitive steps in navigating an AAC system. So which brings us to that if a person has some speech, they can and express their basic needs, they don't need AAC. This graphic is from practical AAC. So if they can request, great, but can they share a story about their lives? Can they relay about a funny event that happened to them? How do they show affection? The goal of AAC is something called SNUG, spontaneous novel utterance generation. And that means that you can say what you want, when you want, how you want it in an autonomous way, but also create something that no one else has said. So it's not pre-programmed for you. You can combine language flexibly and say what you want to say when you want to say it. So it goes way beyond requesting. Which leads us to this quote from Lance. I'll give you a moment to read it. Lance is an adult who uses AAC full-time at this point. And he started using AAC as an adult. He regularly gives speeches about his life and how important AAC has been for him. He wasn't able to access AAC until adulthood because of the myth that if you have some speech and have some natural speech, that should be your primary way of communicating. And this was very limiting to him and had a significant negative impact on his life. And it's not until he got AAC that he was able to lead a more full life. And he especially talks about the social isolation that he experienced before having AAC. I want you to think about the person who knows you best. How often are they accurate in predicting what you want to say? And would you want them talking for you? If your answer is no, it's because, like Melinda Smith said, just because you know me doesn't mean you can express my mind or words for me. We all have autonomy. So another myth is that you need to try low tech first. So like I said earlier, AAC is not stairs. We do not climb from the low tech to the mid tech to the high tech. We do not climb from paper-based to graduate to static display to graduate to robust. You can start at robust, and with a smaller array size, you may only see 5, 6, 10, 50 symbols at a time and open it up gradually. So I'm not saying like that, and that depends on the person, but you don't have to start out with picture exchange or with photos. Like the boy that I mentioned earlier, we would have been stuck there and that would have limited him. There's another girl that I work with who the school was working on reaching from a small array and handing pictures over. She has difficulty coordinating her movements and could not grasp the picture to hold it, to hand it over. So she wasn't making progress with that. I did an assessment and we started out with a dynamic display of up to 8 symbols, and now she's up to 15 3 years later. And now she can tell us that she feels sassy or embarrassed, where if we had waited for her to master that exchange, she would still be at that exchange level and very frustrated. So sometimes we have to probe other methods and figure out what else they can do. AAC is not climbing stairs, because we want to presume potential, but teach competence. So when we're presuming potential, we are approaching, I think this also translates into just life, we are approaching people with the belief that they have the potential to learn. It is our job as stakeholders in their lives to figure out what the best way for them to learn is and what other ways are for them to help them communicate more effectively if they're having difficulty communicating, and how to learn. I think it's also important to remember that when people are using AAC, using AAC is often exhausting, it's mentally taxing, and it's physically taxing. And Lydia Dolly is another AAC user and an advocate, and she has posted on social media and talked about how exhausted she is at the end of the day from using AAC all day. So if we're asking someone to demonstrate knowledge repeatedly, the same thing, like where's red, where's red, where's red, touch red, tell me red. If we're asking them to do that, we're asking them to exert. We all only have a set amount of emotional and energy throughout the day. So if we're asking them to exert that energy that they have for what we want them to communicate, that's taking away energy that they could be learning other ways of symbolic communication and how to communicate better what they want to be communicating. So we need to approach people as they have the potential to learn. It's our job to figure out how to teach them, which is the teaching competence, and how to teach them in a way that others understand better, while still honoring the first and early form of communication. In other words, put yourself in their shoes and ask yourself if it would be good enough for you. If it wouldn't be good enough for you, it probably isn't good enough for them. Presume potential, teach competence. Which leads us to our last myth of AAC will fix the communication difficulties. And I think this quote from Buchelman and Miranda is really profound, because the device is the tool. So think of an AAC system. So similarly to our mouse. So if it's the pictures, if it's the robust system, the dynamic display, static, whatever it is, that is a tool. That is the same thing. So similarly to language and speech, AAC is replacing the speech output. It is not replacing the language. We still need to teach language and the social communication and meeting needs through symbolic ways. So if someone doesn't already have the skills to know how to do that, we need to teach that competence, but presume that they have the ability to learn it. And that is where our therapy will be focused on. If they have those skills already, like some of the kids I work with they understand what they want to say. They just need to learn how to navigate it. So that for them, AAC is a different output method. But still, we can't just hand a communication system off to somebody and expect them to use it. We have to teach it and use it ourselves. So going back to that immersion, and thinking about how long we immerse typically developing kids in language before we expect them to have output. So that is the end of myths. We've gone over a very brief intro to AAC, thrown a lot of terminology at you, very brief on how to support communication development, use the device yourself, and talked about some myths. And I'm going to stop sharing and see what questions there are.
Hi, thank you so much for that awesome presentation, Heidi. That was very informative. So now I have some comments and some questions that we're going to go through. Okay. So first thing I wanted to comment on, I wanted to comment on a couple of the quotes that you had because I thought they really struck me. One was the quote from Melinda, and I don't think I wrote it down verbatim, but it was something to the effect of, just because you know me doesn't mean you can speak for me. Mm-hmm. And I really like that because I know a common theme that I see parents say is that they're the voice for their child. And I know that that is 100% coming from a good place and like a protective place. But it's just interesting because there is a little bit of danger in that and thinking and assuming you know what your child is thinking. And truly, I mean, we probably do know our kids best because all the time, but like, even I admit, like, I don't know what, I can guess what Lucy's thinking. And sometimes we're like, oh, she's thinking something, sassy or funny. And maybe we're right, but maybe she's thinking, God, you all need to shut up. Like, I don't know. Like, I can't, I don't know. I mean, even my verbal children are a mystery to me at times. So it's very, I can see that it can be very presumptuous to think that we know what our children are speaking. So that's just good to keep in mind, even though it is coming from a good place. When parents say that, like, we really have to be very careful in assuming that we know.
Absolutely. And up until the development of about 12 to 18 months, we often do know what kids want. But after that, like you said, kids say funny, weird things. We say funny, weird things. And just because they're going to the fridge and taking out the lasagna, they may want to talk about the lasagna, not necessarily eat the lasagna. So, yeah, like, parents and stakeholders know the kids better than we, myself as a professional, ever will, but we still need to be supporting their own autonomous voice.
Right, correct. And then the other quote I really liked was presume potential, teach competence, from, it was Kate
Ahern.
Yeah. So, and that one, presume competence is a phrase I've heard for ages now and love. And at Grin to Be Foundation, we promote that message a lot, presume competence, but I like the expansion on it of presume potential, teach competence, because that I think is a message that can't be, can't be overused, really.
No, and I think it's just a good motto in life too.
Yeah.
That everyone has potential. We need to figure out how to teach the competence of it.
Right.
Exactly. And all of people everyone has the potential to communicate.
Correct.
It's our job to figure out how to do it and how to help and support it.
Okay. So, another thing that you talked about was, I think it was maybe in the myths, how you don't need prerequisites for a robust AAC system. So the question is, why? I fully agree with that. Why is that not always the case? Why is there inconsistency between, what speech pathologists or teachers or schools, or why are there people that do think there are prerequisites? Like, where does that come from? Is that like an old school way of thinking?
So yes, we used to think that there were prerequisites. So back a little over 20 years ago, when I was in grad school, I was taught in early research, there's a seminal research on symbols that found that there was a typical pattern of development of symbol understanding. And that was extrapolated into, this is the development and how we should teach it. And there's been later research that has not gotten nearly as much attention that has shown that that's not the case, that we learn symbols through doing and through experience. So we're mapping the meaning of the symbol, whether it's oral speech, whether it's pictures, no matter what it is. So we're mapping the meaning of the symbol through our experiences. And for some reason, that research hasn't really been widely recognized or like widely accepted. I think to some degree, it's also that starting small is easier for the caregivers and easier for therapists, but I should say just stakeholders, not just caregivers. It's easier for stakeholders to start small because there's the thought that we don't want to overwhelm the child or the adult. So it's easier for us to start small and build up because typically that's how we think about learning. Where when we're doing that, we're inadvertently gatekeeping. The other piece of it, I think, is in the US and to some degrees other countries as well, for funding, in order to get funding through private insurance in the US, I literally have to explain why lesser means, so like why a paper-based system, so really lesser meaning less expensive means, will not meet their communication needs. So I have to justify when I'm submitting for a device why they can't use a communication book, because the payers don't want to pay for an expensive system. And I think there's also some built-in ableism of, we have this view in mind of what AAC users should be like and how they should progress. And the new research just doesn't support that.
Okay. So what advice would you have for a parent who, doesn't know much about AAC, but they're interested, and then they go to their school and the school wants to start, with something very basic and they don't want to do that? Like, what advice, what are some things they could do if they don't agree with, what the school wants to do, or what the private speech therapist wants to do?
So one is educating, like learning more. I personally spend a lot of time on social media in spaces intended for people who use AAC to educate people who don't use AAC about AAC. So one of those groups on Facebook is Ask Me, I'm an AAC User. And I spend a lot of time reading those responses and educating myself. So also for parents, asking those questions. And spending time in those spaces, but then taking questions back to the professionals of, okay, but so we're working on requesting, but how can I support commenting? How can I support them seeking information? And going back to all of those other functions and asking them, how can I support these functions? And if the answer is they're not ready for those, then also thinking about, okay, how are they currently expressing that? Oftentimes, for many of the kids that I work with and adults I work with, it comes out as challenge in behavior because they're not being understood. Mm-hmm. So, in highlighting that, look, they're expressing frustration. How can I support them? And trying to guide the therapist. Some therapists will also respond if you hit them with research. Some therapists will get defensive over that, honestly, but asking open-ended questions that really help, like that you are wanting their help in supporting communication. So again, same thing with the speech therapist in the school, presume the potential for them to learn to accept robust AAC or that robust is an option. And it's not always appropriate for everyone. Just have to say, like, there is no one size fits all. There is no one place to start. But helping them learn to see what isn't working about the current system. It's an evolution. You're always evaluating, reevaluating, and supporting the development.
Okay. So,
Anyway.
Yeah, that was good. So in typical cases, a school can do an evaluation, correct? Or there are other, I believe, like sometimes I've heard of like hospitals can do evaluations, or maybe like I think doesn't like a local Easter Seals maybe, or you can find if there's a local. So it really wouldn't just necessarily be any speech pathologist. It would have to be one who specializes in AAC. Yes. If you were going that route, as opposed to like through your school or your, local hospital.
Yes. The other thing to ask if the school is doing an evaluation. So not all schools do evaluations the same way. And there's a lot of disagreement within the schools on how you do an evaluation. Some schools have taken a universal approach to everyone gets the same system to start with. And then if that system, students have to prove that system doesn't work for them in order to get access to a different system, which professionally I find very frustrating because the flip side of that is doing an evaluation and following something called the SET process, which was developed by Joy Zabala, which is really more of a framework than a process, that you're looking at the student, the environment, the tasks, and the tools that they need to meet their communication needs. And when you're following that framework and thinking that way, you may end up with different tools than what the teachers are commonly familiar with. So same thing, kind of back to your first question too, asking how are they going to meet these needs in these different environments? So especially if schools say, oh, we give everybody this app to start with, asking why? How do you know that's the best one for my child? It is a challenge to have 5 students in your class of 10 who are using different systems, but it's not about us, it's about them and what works for them. Or at least it should be. So even if the school is evaluating, so yes, schools can evaluate, but make sure that they're evaluating and not just giving what they're familiar with or what they have on hand. And private clinics can evaluate, hospitals can evaluate, but you do want someone with specialized knowledge in AAC.
Okay, that makes sense. So then going back to the modeling that you talked about, and you had those really great statistics about how much you have to model, and with verbal children, with the exposure they have to language, and I don't know, I didn't write it all down, the hours, and this is how long it would take them to master an AAC without being immersed in the modeling. So let's say best case scenario, the caregivers, the school, everyone's fairly, immersed in the modeling. Is it still possible that device mastery still may not be achieved, just depending on, and it's nothing to do with like cognitive but for instance, many kids with Grin 2B, maybe they have limited motor skills, or there's a lot of impulsivity going on in there. And maybe those factors means that sometimes they can use it pretty accurately and sometimes they can't. So I'm just trying to like build expectations am I correct in that like, even if like I know like we are pretty good at modeling our daughter's device. We could certainly do a more consistent job with it. I know her school does a great job with it. But I'm just wondering that maybe this is a question for me personally to, for my guilt. Even if we're doing it more, is it possible that she still may not like master it? I mean, she does use it certainly, but
I'm going to challenge you on mastery, on the idea of mastery. And the reason I'm going to challenge you on that is I think that it's important to think about that we don't do things, humans do not do things to mastery, but in education, we have to, in standardized testing, we're expected to talk about mastery. Communication is not compliance and it's not mastery. We want consistency. So if you're doing it most of the time, great. And also want to remember that it takes typically developing kids 7 years to master spoken English and to learn all of the grammar. And even then we're refining, like we're still refining. I'm in my 40s. I'm still refining my use of grammar and learn. So we are always learning. So it's unrealistic to expect that someone who's using another system that really can be thought about as another language, that they're going to learn to master it within 1 to 2 years. So, and if we think about and take kind of a parallel with English as a second language or learning any second language, we don't expect conversational level for 2 to 3 years. Academic language takes about 5. So if we think about it in those terms and shift our expectations, it's amazing to me when I do a trial of 4 to 6 weeks and the person is using it at all functionally. That's a huge win. It takes a long time to really immerse yourself and to learn how to use the system and to use it other ways of communicating. As kind of a similar question, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent of, I see the question often of, we've been modeling, we've been demonstrating and immersing for 2-3 years, but they're not using it at all. When do I give up or switch? To me, if you're really immersing them in the language and they're not using it back within 2 to 3 years or even a year, that's where even for me, a few months, that's where I start to look at, is this the best system? And what is the fidelity of the demonstration? Are people using it for their own messages, or is it a compliance that they're using it for what they want them to say? How much language is there? Because I've found a trend that use will go down when the words they want aren't there. So I've seen this with quite a few clients as I'm building their language systems. So they're on robust systems, but they may only have access to like 100 words. And they've mostly learned where those 100 words are some of the time, or show me like on 1 or 2 sessions that they have found them all, most of them. And then use goes down. And professionals, and I think parents, a lot of people have the tendency then of, they're not using it, let's take away, it's overwhelming. I've actually found the reverse to be true of let's give more. And then use goes back up and then it kind of plateaus or decreases. I add more words. So I end up with this trajectory over time, but then also as you're learning the system, so that takes more cognitive effort, other things may go down for a bit and then come back up. So it's that constant monitoring and really, I think, trying to understand everything that goes into using ways other than natural speech to communicate and really questioning our expectation of mastery.
Okay, thank you. No, that was really, I liked the way you questioned. use of the word mastery. No, that's really it's a really good, important perspective. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so I think that covers the bulk of the questions that I had or were given to me. The last one that I think we wanted to go over was, do you have references or resources to share that people can look at? I know you mentioned some Facebook groups.
Yes.
Which I would second that. I'm in several AAC groups.
Now let me pull up, because I forgot to share my slide. So if you are on my slides, they're at the very end. So I'm going to reshare my screen. Hopefully it will be in the same spot, roughly. All right. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. The AAC agreements, which is the first one listed, has agreements that are supported by research and other links to research articles. So for the people who are looking for support of what are, I don't want to say best practices because we're looking at good, solid practices, that is a really good place to start. And it has links to references as well. So if you wanted to provide resources to other people, the Wakelet for AAC resources down here. Also, so AAC tips, this is, which hopefully you can see my, here I can actually annotate. So this is a great resource of social media and what website, so it has websites, but it also has Facebook groups, it has Instagram, I think it has Twitter handles. So basically, if you are looking for social media related to AAC, check out this Wakelet. Full disclosure, my Instagram page and Facebook page are on it, but there is a ton of information on this. The creator spent many, many hours, I think an entire summer, putting this together. And then if you're looking for more scholarly references, the second page of resources and references has some scholarly ones, and then as does the third page and the fourth page. So there are a lot of scholarly references there as well. Again, if it is easier and you wanted to follow the QR code, that will take the QR code there will take you to my handout or bit.ly/intro AAC.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing all those resources. That's great. I believe we also have on our green2b.com, the resources tab, there should be a section of AAC resources. They're probably not as in-depth as Heidi's, but I think there are a few links to different AAC Facebook groups. And then certainly you can search AAC on Facebook and find many wonderful resources. So that wraps up our intro to AAC. That was a lot of wonderful information. Thank you so much, Heidi, for sharing all that. This is such an important topic to our Grin2B community, as many of our kids are, I was going to say nonverbal, but it seems like that word is on the way out. What would be the correct word? Would it be
either
no natural, I don't know. No natural speech? That's awkward to say.
Yeah. No. So I usually say AAC users, multimodal communicators.
Okay.
It's awkward to say whose natural speech can't meet their communication needs. Yeah. So like I said, AAC users are frustrated with nonverbal, nonvocal, because people presume incorrectly about language abilities.
Okay. So
and those were terms from psychology.
Okay. So I could say that many Grin2B children are multimodal communicators?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. I'm going to have to really think about that. About changing some of that language, because the nonverbal word is definitely one that we use regularly.
And it's one that I use as well, and I'm also making that shift.
Yeah, no, I know people get frustrated when language shifts. I find it very interesting and fascinating, and especially if I think it's important when people that are part of that group themselves tell you that the particular language you're used to is not correct anymore, or why it's wrong. It's important for us to listen. It's not for us, the parents, to decide, oh no, nonverbal is fine.
Exactly.
So I'll have to really think about that one a lot. So yes, and I'm sure this topic of AAC is one that we will address again in the future, most likely next July 2022, when we do our in-person, finally, family weekend. It is most likely that we will have another session on AAC, so we can dive into this more fully. But yes, I hope everyone enjoyed learning about AAC. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and we will see what we can do to help you. So thank you again, Heidi, for sharing your time with us.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.